Happy holidays! My name is Yishis, and I play a thief on the Blackgate server. Today I'll be presenting several outnumbered fights, followed by some 1v1s with more competent players in World v World. Also, this video is longer than usual, as several of the 1v1s are rather involved. Please check the video description for links to different fights that may interest you more, and also for my spec. First, we'll dispatch of an Elementalist, Thief, and Guardian. I open by taking falling damage from Descent of Shadows. This gives me an initial stealth, and allows me to backstab and quickly dispatch of a very squishy Elementalist. I immediately follow with a Blinding Powder to confuse the enemies on my position. This allows me to gain a stomp without the Elementalist using Mistform. My next target will be the Thief, as he's likely to be the next squishiest and also the most dangerous. One Cloak and Dagger does a huge amount of damage, telling me that he's full glass, so I follow in with one additional Heartseeker to immediately take him down. I go for a Shadow Step Stomp in order to confuse them on my positioning, but the Thief realizes and ports away. Still, this allows me to avoid the Guardian's heavy damage, and I decide I need to just finish down the Thief with my Shortbow. Poison allows me to reduce the downstate regeneration of the Thief, and I now just need to make sure I finish him off without him killing the mob, as that would revive him. Additionally, I've realized that the Guardian is full glass and does a lot of damage, so I just make sure to kite him around with the mobility of my Shortbow. Before opening on the Guardian, I use a Shadow Refuge to regain some health and gain the upper hand. This allows for a strong backstab, and I move in for a Heartseeker to finish him off, but he uses a block and prevents it. Due to his low health, I stay very aggressive by using Blinding Powder and immediately backstabbing again. I heal up to gain stealth, take a knockdown from his Signet, but then finish off with one more backstab to get him in the downstate and gain a successful stomp. These players were definitely less than ideal, however I like to open with a bang to keep people interested. Stay tuned for later fights with more intelligent players. As I move away from the players that I've downed, I find a Necromancer coming in with full stacks and food, and decide to open on her with Heavy Burst. A Steel Cloak and Dagger combo allows me to fear her from stealth and then open with upfront damage. Given the amount of damage she's taking, I know she's heavy glass, and I know I need to stay very aggressive, otherwise her damage will outpace mine. She stacks a lot of pressure in her Death Shroud, so I Cloak and Dagger and regain stealth, and manage to follow up with one final burst combo to take her down. Had I not managed to take her down there, I would have had to begin to retreat, as her burst potential was becoming too high. Regardless, she manages to go down, and I use a quick Shadow Step to reduce her downstate burst, and then move back in to gain a successful stomp. This first clip was shot before the December 10th patch, so I did not have Shadow's Embrace and needed to be very careful about condition stacking on me, as stealth would not clear it. The rest of this video will be after December 10th, and I will be using Shadow's Embrace. Next, I open on a Guardian, Warrior, and Elementalist. Noticing that they're heavily focused on the Sentry, I stealth up and immediately decide to go for AoE Burst with Shortbow's Cluster Bomb. This is generally a riskier tactic, as I'm unable to easily stealth with Shortbow out. As soon as I gain their attention, I immediately use Dagger Storm to cripple them and gain stability to prevent any knockdowns, then move back in knowing that I've managed the dispatch of a very glassy Elementalist. I backstab in order to keep her health low and panic her so she goes into Mistform. I then take a knockback from the Guardian. This provides a perfect way to juke the enemies by using Blinding Powder and then immediately stepping to the Elementalist to gain a stomp while they assume that I'm still back where they knocked me away. I next catch the Guardian trying to revive, which allows me to get a clean backstab, and I realize she's fairly glass heavy. I immediately steal to her and use the stolen ability to interrupt her, and then continue to put heavy pressure on her. As the two begin to get me low, I move back out to avoid their melee hits, heal up, which grants me stealth, and I then move back in to try to finalize the kill on the Guardian. I get pulled by the Guardian, so I remain in stealth and wait for the crowd control to end, then move back in and attempt to Cloak and Dagger. Unfortunately, I miss it, which leaves me too open to burst, so I'm forced to Shadow Refuge. I then get hit by the Warrior's Sword Throw, which immobilizes and snares me. I then move in to finish off the Guardian, however, a commander from my realm moves in and scares him away. Instead, I decide to chase down the Warrior and hope for a fairly good 1v1. The other individuals on my realm move off and chase down the Guardian in another direction. The Warrior continues to kite, and they have extremely good mobility, so I'm forced to just continue to use Dancing Dagger to try and slow him down. Finally, I switch to Shortbow in order to stealth immobilize the Warrior. The Immobilize prevents his Adrenaline Stun from hitting me, however I then get knocked down by his hammer and then take a Bull's Charge. Instead of immediately using a utility, I decide to absorb the damage as it wasn't enough of a threat yet, and this allows me to preserve a cooldown. Against a tanky crowd control warrior like this, it's important to properly pick and choose when to use your stun break utilities, as you won't have enough to break through all of their crowd control. He places a well-timed Adrenaline Stun and then follows it with a hammer knockdown. Knowing that he's now used all of his crowd control abilities, I then choose to Shadow Step away, as it will prevent him from being able to finish me off while I'm controlled. I toy with him a bit, but then notice his hammer coming back out, so I quickly evade away from the Adrenaline Stun, then notice his Arcing Swing, which is his second knockback. Knowing now that he's again gone through all of his stun chain, I can quickly put some good damage into him without the risk of being controlled. I managed to get enough pressure on him to get him to use Endure Pain, and I now need only to skirt around him and avoid damage to wait for that to drop. However, he follows with a well-timed Bull's Charge, so I immediately use Blinding Powder. This is enough to usually confuse the enemy on the positioning, even though it's not actually a stun break. He breaks off from his 100 blades, and then starts to kite away as he's low on health and definitely low on cooldowns. Here I make a mistake and switch to Shortbow, expecting that he was going to continue to run, when instead he turns and opens with a very strong crowd control. Thus, I'm forced to shadow step away in order to avoid most of the damage. I try to get a Shortbow immobilized, but he's too far away, so I move up to him, and he then again turns with a great Earthshaker attempting to stun me, but I notice it and manage to avoid it. Fighting a Hammer Warrior is always a lot of excitement, as you need to constantly be watching for their telegraphed stun moves and avoiding them. As long as you can manage to avoid those stuns, you'll be fine. However, as I say this, I again take a good Earthshaker, so I immediately use Blinding Powder to confuse him and cause him to miss his Bull's Charge. At this point, he's very low on health, and I know that he's low on cooldowns, so I'm able to move in aggressively and finish him off. For the next fight, I have a special guest, Defensive Armor from OPP, and we have a great 2v3 against this guild group of enemies. I open with Thieves Guild to make our numbers look larger than they are, and then steal from the Necro to get an opening fear. Noticing the Elementalist using Churning Earth, I make sure to stealth near her, which blinds her to prevent that damage. Defensive Armor and I are not communicating at all, and we just happen to run across each other for this fight. However, we both innately know that Necromancer is always the greatest threat out of these classes. He does a great job stunning the Necromancer, which allows me to get strong burst while Defensive continues to kite. The enemies then try to ring me in and focus my position, but I remain in stealth, and my blind on stealth prevents most of the damage. I manage to get the Necromancer down and go for a Shadow Step Stomp to try to finish him off. However, they manage to revive him, but we again quickly finish him off and go for one more stomp, with Defensive distracting them enough to gain it successfully. The next most threatening target is the Elementalist, and Defensive is already putting hits into her as I open on her. As I attempt a finalizing backstab, the Elementalist intelligently goes into mist form and prevents the kill. While waiting for that to end, I put some damage into the Guardian, and then switch my focus back to the Elementalist to keep the pressure up on her. Noticing that she's just now using her heals from water form, I know that I can move in with heavier damage, knowing that she won't be able to switch back to water form for some time. Going aggressive, I decide to stay in the Churning Earth, expecting my blind on stealth to have prevented the damage. However, the blind gets cleared, so I must retreat with Shadow Refuge, and then use a few poisons with my Shortbow while I heal up. As I cannot yet switch weapons, I decide to open on the Guardian with the Shortbow and bait him backwards away from the Elementalist. With the two enemies separated, they can't AoE support each other nearly as well, and Defensive is able to capitalize by putting extreme damage pressure into the Elementalist, and then I can move in with a strong backstab and finish her off. Noticing the Elementalist may not mist form, I break off, steal from the Guardian, and use the ability to try to daze him and prevent the revive. The Elementalist then does mist form, and I notice Defensive putting damage pressure in, so I'm able to go for a stomp while he prevents any revive. Finally, Defensive and I are just left to chase down this extremely tanky Guardian and eventually finish him off. Again, Defensive and I were not communicating in any way for this fight. However, I think this truly communicates that really well-versed players in Guild Wars 2 know the ins and outs well enough that even without communicating, we know exactly what type of actions need to happen when, and what the best ways of teamwork are. Thanks again to Defensive Armor for an excellent fight. For the rest of this video, I'll be moving into 1v1s against more competent players. First up is a Prismatic Understanding Condition Mesmer. This spec is becoming extremely abundant and is a rather annoying and very powerful spec to fight. The Mesmer will be countering my stealth with her own stealth that applies an abundant amount of boons every time she enters stealth, while trying to wear me down with condition damage. The trick against this spec is extreme patience and waiting for your enemy to make a mistake. Both her and I have an abundant amount of stealth as well as survivability from stealth. Patience in this type of fight involves an extreme amount of Cloak and Dagger on her clones in order to make sure you maintain the overall upper hand on stealth uptime. Each time you stealth, you remove a condition, thus reducing her overall condition stacking effectiveness. Notice as I just took a daze from her Chaos Storm, I gained a huge amount of confusion stacks, thus telling me that she's running Perplexity runes, which is common with this spec. I use a heal in order to regain health and drop those condition stacks through Shadow's Embrace. I then stealth off a Phantasm and then go for a backstab. However, as I do it, she uses her illusionary counter on the Scepter, which stacks a huge amount of Torment. Unfortunately, I didn't have any evasion at the time to avoid the Torment stack, and thus I'm forced to Blinding Powder in order to drop those conditions. She then puts up her Chaos Armor, and I wait for that to end. However, as soon as I open, she drops a Chaos Storm, which I again do not want to be inside of. Thus, I use Dagger Storm in order to get some ranged damage on her, as well as to clear any clones that she puts up, and also hit her while she's in stealth. As I'm left in the open, I use a heal to regain stealth and gain the upper hand, and then go for a backstab, again unfortunately hitting her illusionary counter, thus gaining torment stacks. Generally, as soon as you notice the enemy in a block animation like that and you put a hit into her, you should immediately evade to avoid those torment stacks. Unfortunately, I was not doing a very good job of that during this fight. I then again need to wait for the Chaos Storm to end, and then as I move in to open, I notice an Aegis go up, so I first attack, then I notice her illusionary counter, so I use a Cloak and Dagger, which blinds her and prevents the Torment. She again goes into stealth, but my Heartseeker hits her, and my auto attack chain progresses, telling me that I've hit her at least some. I then re-stealth on a Phantasm and get a decent backstab into her, however my damage is constantly reduced by her high protection uptime from Prismatic Understanding. Regardless, I continue to attack and get a few more auto attack hits in while she's in stealth. I notice her exit stealth, but observe that she has a block buff, so I instead re-stealth one more time to wait for that to fall, then open again with a good backstab. It's very important to pay attention to what buffs Prismatic Understanding applies to the Mesmer. While she'll pretty much have permanent regeneration and protection in a drawn-out fight, you can at least pay attention to the block buff and increase your backstab efficiency based on that. At this point, I've now worn her down to a fairly low health pool, which usually means you can go rather aggressive and finish her off. However, this Mesmer does an excellent job going defensive at this point, and she effectively uses her distortion to prevent my finishing blow. I continue to stay extremely aggressive and Heartseeker right into her Scepter counter, thus taking huge torment stacks and having to heal up. I again try to finish her off with a backstab, but due to her high protection, it doesn't do enough damage, and I continue to get worn down by her conditions. At this point, I've begun to push entirely too aggressively and again take another torment stack from her counter. At this point, I've realized my mistake and retreat into Shadow Refuge to slightly regain health and open with a more reserved mind. Shadow Refuge has given me the stealth uptime upper hand, and as she pops out of stealth, I get a great backstab. I manage to get a full auto attack chain into her and notice that she's low enough that I can steal in and go fully aggressive. A blind prevents my Cloak and Dagger, so I immediately Blinding Powder and Heartseeker in order to catch her off guard and gain a successful stomp. Fights against this type of Mesmer are almost always drawn out, but remain patient and eventually you'll come out on top. Next is a short fight against a Dagger Pistol Thief. Similar to the Mesmer, patience is also extremely important here. The Dagger Pistol Thief has more mobility and more blinds than you, so you need to wait for them usually to make the first move, and then quickly counter them and catch them off guard. Already, the thief got a strong backstab into me, and I needed to Blinding Powder in order to retreat away from him. As she Heartseekers out of the black powder, I know she's in that area and manage to get some hits into her. She Basilisk Venoms, I Shadow Step away, anticipate the Shadow Shot, auto attack to break the blind, then Cloak and Dagger to regain stealth. I watch where she Heartseekers into and gain a successful backstab while she's in stealth. I take a strong backstab from her and immediately move away to prevent damage. I then steal in to try and gain a stealth from her, however she blinds me at exactly the right moment, so I instead am forced to Shadow Refuge. She now wants to gain the upper hand on stealth uptime, so she refuges, and I predict where she may be and manage to get a backstab into her while she's in stealth. This forces her out with another very strong backstab, and I'm forced to heal up. I then immediately reopen and keep extreme pressure on her. She stealths up one more time, but I manage to auto-attack directly into where I think she may be about to backstab me, and this fully dispatches of her, and I'm able to finish her off. Next I take on a notoriously tough fight for a thief, a Condition Engineer. Again, this fight involves heavy use of stealth in order to counter the conditions with Shadow's Embrace, and positioning in order to avoid his AoE zone control with bombs and Toolkit. Upon opening, the thief has already established zone control by using his supply crate. I get some damage into the turrets and cripple the thief by using Dagger Storm, then retreat away with a Shadow Step to pull him out of the zone control of his elite. I stay in stealth to avoid his crowbar, and then get a good backstab into him. He immediately uses block on his toolkit, and then uses the block on his shield, which stuns me, so I follow up with a blinding powder to prevent the confusion and blind from his pistol. I have enough current pressure momentum going that I decide to move back in and fight him in the midst of his turrets one more time. However, I begin to take a bit too much pressure and decide that the conditions are going to remain too heavy, so I stealth up and move back out, attempting to bait him by shooting some poison shots with my Shortbow. He gains a successful pull and confusion stack with crowbar, and I panic and Shortbow right into his turrets. Thus, I'm forced to Shadow Refuge and back out. I retreat back up the hill and fire some poison shots to keep the engineer in combat. My hope was to bait him up to this top hill area and fight up here rather than in the line-obstructing trees. However, he doesn't comply, so I instead steal in and reopen one more time. He blocks with his toolkit to prevent the backstab, so I Cloak and Dagger, move back, and then try to open again. However, he blocks at just the right moment, and I take a stun from the shield, so I'm forced to Blinding Powder to move back out. As I open with a good backstab, he begins to drop bombs and regain zone control, so I evade out, throw gunk, and use Dagger number 3 a few times. This doesn't really do much effective for damage. It's a whirl and applies a few confusion stacks, but overall it allowed me to evade a few of the engineer's upfront damage abilities while he had zone control, and is generally just a confusing ability that most are not used to experiencing. I attempt to re-stealth on him, but he blocks the ability, but manages to miss his crowbar. This allows me to Cloak and Dagger once more to re-stealth and clear condition stacks. He again lays bombs, controlling that area, so I stay in stealth and wait for their effect to finish, then move in to try and reopen one more time. However, I take confusion from him and then a knockback, and his perplexity runes stack a huge amount of conditions on me. Thus, I'm forced to retreat and heal up. As I move to reopen, I avoid his bombs and notice that he's kiting away a little bit. I decide that I'm going to throw gunk at him and then notice that he's laid his big old bomb, so I stay away from that to avoid the knockback, then switch to Shortbow and evade to offset his pistol shots. This type of engineer is most effective when you're directly on top of them in their zone control, so the Shortbow allows me to stay out of range and reset the fight a bit. However, he then realizes this and begins to kite, so I move up to him and re-stealth. Likely anticipating a backstab, he immediately rocket boots away. I try to throw a dancing dagger to slow him down, but it's too far away. So, I move back in and re-stealth, again avoiding his bombs. The sentry has now respawned, and the crowd control from its abilities would be too much to handle while the engineer is establishing area control around me. Thus, I decide I need to quickly focus my attention and dispatch of the sentry. I get a few good backstabs, throw gunk and Heartseeker in order to gain a quick chaos armor, then Shortbow to back off and quickly dispatch of the sentry. As the engineer tries to put AoE around me, I Shortbow away to stay out of that, and then use the Shortbow a few more times to get some AoE pressure, then heal up and move back in for an opening with my daggers. As I re-stealth, his supply crate comes back off cooldown and he uses it, which puts me in an extremely long stun followed by a mobilized chain, so I'm forced to continually re-stealth to avoid the AoE zone control and eventually step out with my Shortbow. At this point, I need to again bait the engineer away from his area of control as I can't fight in the middle of those elite turrets. He continues to apply pressure with pistol shots, and while I could use a utility, I decide to save the cooldown, wait for my heal to come back, and use that instead. I get a decent backstab in, and he begins to retreat back out. However, I refuse to follow him down there and want to make sure I can fight on my terms away from his turrets. I move in for another successful backstab and have enough pressure that it actually causes him to panic and mess up his heal turret's blast finisher, so he doesn't get as much healing as he should. He rocket boots away and I follow, which allows me to avoid the big old bomb. I then re-stealth one more time and have him very close to death, so I backstab again, and he's so low that I'm able to finish him off with an auto attack chain and then finalize with a stomp. This type of fight is also generally a battle of attrition, and you need to just draw it out long enough for the enemy to make a mistake and then fall. For the next fight, I'll take on a Condition warrior that I found was fairly well played. I open with a backstab and he immediately goes into his sword offhand block, which stacks bleeds if I manage to swing into it, so I instead evade away and then try to reopen. He moves away with his greatsword spin, so I use Dancing Dagger to slow him down and then re-stealth with a Cloak and Dagger. While he attempts to hit me in stealth, I move around him and get a good backstab in. Being extremely nimble-footed and circling around your enemy in this type of fight is very beneficial to throw them off guard. While you're in stealth, you can reposition and throw the enemy off on your reopening. As I stealth up, the enemy uses his greatsword rush and then spins back in and continues to evade. Thus, I switch to Shortbow and decide to attrition the enemy down with a few evades and to pull him back with counter-positioning. This is usually a good tactic if the enemy has experienced your usual Cloak and Dagger backstab combo and you want to throw them off and confuse them on exactly what it is you're playing for tactics. Then, when they least expect it, you can switch back to Cloak and Dagger backstab, such as now, and get some reopenings that are usually going to land much easier. However, I then go too aggressive with the stolen ability spin and take an immobilize from his sword main hand, then 100 blades, which does a lot of damage, so I have to heal up. I capitalize on his success by immediately backstabbing and throwing him to low health, and he's unable to respond in time, which allows me to open, get a quick Heartseeker, and take him down. I notice a low-level Necromancer coming in as I go for the stomp, so I use a Shadow Step just to ensure that I gain the stomp successfully. At this point, I'm low on health, and the Necromancer has used all of her wells, so I just use a Shadow Refuge to regain health and then reopen once the wells have expired to quickly finish her off. As it's just an up-leveled enemy, I'm speeding up that part of the fight, and then showing a cool finisher. By the way, props to ArenaNet, the Snow Globe finisher is extremely well done. Next up, I'll take on a power-based Mesmer. Usually these types of fights are over fairly quickly, as you can get good strong burst and finish them off, as they're much squishier than their condition-based counterparts. They tend to lack many defensive stats and don't have prismatic understanding for boons. However, this Mesmer does an extremely good job of paying attention to her positioning to lock me down and do great bursts, so it makes for an excellent fight. So far, we both just blown our initial burst, and I've used Dagger Storm in order to cripple her and clear some of her excess clones. She realizes that I'm in a better position to open, and so intelligently kites out, and I would rather not chase after her for her to open, so I instead use her clones to re-stealth and gain the opening upper hand. I attempt to steal backstab, however my camera goes wonky, and I manage to miss the backstab. I attempt to counter by using Dagger number 4 to cripple her, and then Cloak and Dagger to stealth. However, she goes invulnerable with Sword number 2, which prevents that tactic, and I need to re-stealth on a clone instead. At this point, she remains effectively out of range of me, so I continue to re-stealth on clones until I can gain a good opening shot. She ports into me again for some burst, but I manage to offset most of it in stealth. I then try to backstab on her, but hit a clone instead, which forces me into a defensive position, and I take some damage from a phantasm. Thus, I cloak and dagger to stealth again, and then attempt to reopen on her. I try to throw a dancing dagger to slow down her kiting with cripple, however she immediately uses sword 2 to prevent that, then uses her focus pull to further throw off my positioning. I steal up to her to re-stealth right away, however I also take big bursts from her phantasms again. She attempts to immobilize me with Illusionary Leap, however her stolen ability had given me a block buff which prevented that, and I'm able to re-stealth on a clone. However, I again take rather large damage from the phantasms. I attempt to backstab, which she evades, and then she throws a Zerker Phantasm, which do extreme damage, so I make sure to avoid that. She then blinks away, so I Heartseek her up to try and hit her in stealth. She opens again with her Leap Blurred Frenzy combo, but I manage to evade out of it and then heal up. As I move in to reopen on her, I stop in my tracks and notice the focus pull coming, so I immediately evade away from it to avoid the cripple, pull, and Zerker damage. I then try to counter with a backstab, but hit directly into a clone. This puts me into a really dangerous position, and I try to Dagger Storm to clear the excess clones and phantasms. However, I take a double Zerker Phantasm burst, which does an extreme amount of damage, and I'm forced to retreat into a Shadow Refuge. As I do this, I immediately line of sight behind a pillar to prevent the Greatsword knockback. I go to reopen, but find the Mesmer using Blurred Frenzy, so I evade away and then attempt to backstab, but I hit directly into a clone that spawns as she evades away. This leaves me way too vulnerable, so I'm forced to Shadow Step away and heal up. She continues the pressure with a focus pull, which forces me into taking the Zerker's extreme damage, so I'm forced to clear the Zerker with a cloak and dagger and reset my positioning. I re-stealth one more time on a phantasm to make sure it's not a Zerker phantasm, and then reopen on her again. I attempt to evade through her burst, but again get hit by the Zerker Phantasm, which cripples me, so I can't get a stealth off, and am forced to Blinding Powder to retreat. She also manages to knock me into the water, and then I take another Zerker burst. At this point, I'm again left with low health, and am forced to heal up. I reopen again with good damage, but I'm also out of utilities and defensives at this point, so I need to make sure I'm playing extremely carefully. I line of sight behind the pillar to prevent the focus pull, and then re-stealth on a phantasm. This allows me to cleanly open with a backstab again, but she then goes into her defensive Blurred Frenzy, and I have to re-stealth one more time. At this point, she's also low on cooldowns, and retreats into her elite stealth. Without any phantasms to cloak and dagger on, I wait for her to reopen, then gain something that I can re-stealth on. I then again fall victim to the focus pull, but remain in stealth so I can avoid most of the damage. I then again move in for burst, but notice her Blurred Frenzying, so I hold off, then Shadow Step up to her, and attempt to do an additional round of burst. However, I take a knockback from her, but manage to again re-stealth from her abundance of clones. The block buff from what I stole, as well as the blind on stealth, prevents most of the Zerker's damage, and I then decide that I need to re-stealth a few more times to clear the Zerker out. From here, I know I have my defensives available, and my heal almost off cooldown, so I go in more aggressive, get a good backstab, and avoid her Blurred Frenzy. However, she again has a good abundance of phantasms, so I use Blinding Powder to hopefully avoid most of the damage, and then wait for a good opening. I stealth one more time, trying to clear out that Zerker Knight and prevent most of its damage, but again take a focus pull, and then get hit by the Zerker's spin. However, the Mesmer now blinks away, likely knowing that I have the better opening, so I Heartseeker up to her, then steal and get a good backstab. However, she counters again with a Zerker spin and great upfront damage, so I'm forced to heal and back off slightly. I use the stolen ability to gain boons for a better opening, however she retreats too far away, so I wait for her to come back towards me. I then stealth to break the immobilize from her leap chain, and then continue to put pressure on her, avoiding the Blurred Frenzy, and then stealthing one more time. At this point, she's again retreated to another part of the island, probably again knowing that I have a better opening, so I continue to try and remain stealth, and then wait for her to return towards me. I see a phantasm spawn behind me and evade to prevent the damage, then use the stolen ability to try and get a good reopening. However, she again Blurred Frenzies, and I backstab uselessly into a clone. I then take another Zerker spin, which cripples me, so I'm forced to again retreat and cloak and dagger. However, I then find another good backstab opening, and at this point have done enough damage in that backstab that I can follow up with Heartseekers, knowing she won't have enough cooldowns, and this allows me to finally successfully get her down and complete the stomp. For the final fight, I'll take on an extremely tanky Guardian. As he opens on me, I immediately steal and then cloak and dagger to open on him and confuse him on my positioning. I manage to evade the pull and then use the stolen ability to interrupt him and continue to put heavy pressure on him. He uses his heal, which prevents my cloak and dagger, and I can't re-stealth, so I instead set up Basilisk Venom. Then I wait for the blind to fall off of me so that the Basilisk Venom can hit and get good upfront damage into him. He then uses his elite and goes immune again, and then applies a block buff, so I need to continue to just break through his defenses and then eventually reopen. At this point, he retreats far too close to the keep, so I back off and wait for him to move back out, trying to avoid the guards from aggroing. I allow him to finish off the wolves he had aggroed, and then move the fight back out away from the keep, get some decent damage into him, but take a pull from the greatsword. He then uses his heal, and I evade away from his greatsword number 2 to avoid that burst. However, the guards have still managed to attack, so I remain in stealth and kite back away from the keep further. From here, I re-engage with a dancing dagger to slow him down briefly, and then attempt a cloak and dagger, but he evades through it. I then try to get more burst, but take a blind from his greatsword number 3. Expecting that he'll pull next, I manage to stay just out of range, then move in with a successful cloak and dagger, and go for a backstab with a Basilisk Venom, which does good damage and knocks him down to half health. I attempt to stay aggressive, but take too much overall damage from his greatsword spin, so I back out. At this point, he switches into staff and goes defensive to heal up. I then attempt to move behind him to avoid the staff AoE and get a good backstab, but he continues to turn around and then uses the wall from the staff, which knocks me down twice. The staff, being such a defensive weapon, can make it hard to finish off the Guardian in that state. So I wait for him to switch to his greatsword. He then tries to open on me, and I stealth up with Blinding Powder. However, he's getting good damage into me from this point and gets a successful pull, so I back out while in stealth and wait for him to go back into his defensive mode. Generally, one of the best times you have to finish off a tanky Guardian is to catch him off guard when he's in his own offensive stance. However, this is also the time where you have the highest probability of getting bursted down if you're not careful. He again goes into greatsword and leaps away. I know that he's going to try and open with a strong AoE, so I immediately stealth and evade away from that, and then gain the chance to try and get some good damage into him. I get a few decent hits, but he's again doing pretty heavy AoE damage. He manages to attack through the blind and gain a successful pull, which leaves me no choice but to Blinding Powder to escape his AoE. Unfortunately, his damage has continued to outpace mine in the overall sustained fight, so I'm forced to stealth up and back out with another heal. He uses this time to heal up as well, and I move in for a backstab and decide to absorb some of the AoE damage, as I knew I had him blinded. At this point, I plan to reopen again, however he switches to staff and puts up a block buff, then immediately follows it with a wall, which completely suppresses any damage I was hoping to do. Thus, I back off and wait for him to inevitably switch to his greatsword again. However, this time I know I'll have Basilisk Venom ready, and this should allow me to offset his overall damage and take him down. I wait for him to blow through all of his offensive greatsword abilities, then put up my own Basilisk Venom. As he chases me down, I heal up, go into stealth, and get a very strong backstab and a lot of pressure with the Basilisk Venom. However, he counters immediately with the heal, and then his own greatsword burst, followed by using his elite, which allows him to fully reset his health. As he continues to apply pressure, I again notice the block buff, break it with an auto attack, and re-stealth. However, he's continuing to throw extreme pressure, manages to get a pull on me, and then great AoE damage, so I'm forced to Shadow Refuge in order to stay safe. I manage to catch him without a protection buff and get a good backstab into him and get him below half health. However, he's able to almost immediately counter with his heal. I break his block buff and then open again, expecting that he'll stay in offensive mode. I try to stealth, but he manages to evade through the cloak and dagger, and then gets a successful pull on me. As he blinds me, I'm unable to cloak and dagger, and instead need to Blinding Powder. However, I now have Basilisk Venom available again, and I know that he's out of cooldowns. This allows me to get a completely uninterrupted burst combo, which allows me to fully take him down. And that completes this video. Thanks everyone for watching and your continued support. I hope you have a great end of the year, and happy holidays.